The strange thing about losing everything is that sometimes it happens long before you realize it's gone. Ethan Bennett woke up just after 6 in the morning to a silence that felt unfamiliar. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Beverly Hills estate glowed with pale California sunlight, washing the marble floors in gold. For a moment, he smiled. The previous evening had ended exactly the way he wanted. No arguments, no confrontations, no difficult conversations waiting for him. Just freedom. At least, that was what he told himself. He rolled out of bed and reached for his phone. 3 missed calls from his assistant. 2 emails marked urgent. Nothing unusual. He walked downstairs, expecting to smell fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. Instead, the house felt empty. Not quiet. Empty. The difference was impossible to ignore. Ethan slowed his steps. The kitchen counters were spotless. No mug beside the coffee machine. No handwritten note reminding him about his 9 o'clock meeting. No neatly organized folder waiting where it always was. He frowned. Charlotte was usually awake before him. She always had been. For years, she moved through the mornings like a calm current beneath the surface of his life, taking care of things he barely noticed. He glanced toward the dining room. No sign of her. Maybe she had gone out early. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. No reply. Minutes later, he climbed the staircase toward the master suite. Something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling followed him like a shadow. When he opened the walk-in closet, he stopped. One side was empty. Completely empty. The dresses were gone. The shoes were gone. The luggage was gone. Every trace of Charlotte Bennett had vanished. Ethan stared at the rows of vacant shelves. His heartbeat quickened. He crossed the room and opened another door. Empty. Then another. Empty. It looked less like someone had packed for a trip and more like someone had quietly erased themselves from existence. That's when he noticed the ring. His wedding band still rested on his finger. Charlotte sat alone on the nightstand beside a folded piece of paper. Suddenly, the room felt colder. He picked up the note. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, controlled, steady. There were only 6 words. You finally have what you wanted. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then a third time. No accusations. No anger. No dramatic farewell. Just 6 words. Somehow, that made it worse. He looked around the room again, expecting to feel relief. For months, he had convinced himself the marriage was already over. He had repeated the thought so many times it felt true. Yet standing there, surrounded by silence, he felt something else. Something unsettling. The house wasn't missing furniture. It wasn't missing decorations. It was missing her. Downstairs, his phone started ringing again. Then another notification appeared. Then another. The day was beginning. Problems were already waiting. Ethan ignored them all and stared at the note in his hand. Outside, Los Angeles moved through another perfect morning beneath a cloudless sky. Inside the mansion, for the first time in years, Charlotte Bennett was nowhere to be found. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, the woman who had just walked out the door had taken far more than a suitcase with her. By noon, the note was already folded into Ethan Bennett's jacket pocket, but the words refused to leave his mind. You finally have what you wanted. He had read them so many times that morning that they seemed burned into the back of his eyes. Yet as the hours passed, he became determined not to let them bother him. That was the story he chose to believe. Charlotte had left. The marriage had been fading for years. This was inevitable, maybe even necessary. By late afternoon, he was sitting at an upscale restaurant in West Hollywood across from Chloe Hart. Sunlight reflected off the glass walls while expensive cars rolled past outside. Chloe smiled as she stirred her iced tea and watched him carefully. So she's really gone? She asked. Ethan nodded. Looks that way. Chloe leaned back in her chair. There was satisfaction in her expression, though she tried to hide it. Then maybe it is time you stop acting like a married man. Ethan laughed. For the first time that day, the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with conversation and success. Business executives closed deals over lunch. Influencers posed for photos. Everything felt normal. Everything felt promising. That evening, Chloe arrived at the estate carrying 2 designer bags and a smile that suggested she already belonged there. Ethan did not stop her. In fact, he welcomed the distraction. The empty spaces Charlotte left behind suddenly felt less noticeable when someone else occupied the room. They ordered takeout from an expensive steakhouse. Music played softly through the speakers. Chloe walked through the mansion admiring the artwork, the furniture, the view stretching across Los Angeles. "This place is incredible," she said. Ethan raised a glass. "It is ours now." The words slipped out naturally. He did not think about them until later. Chloe smiled immediately. She liked the sound of that sentence. Maybe too much. But Ethan ignored the thought. His phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the evening. Emails, messages, notifications from work. He silenced them all. For one night, he wanted to enjoy what felt like a new beginning. Around 9 o'clock, a few friends joined them. The atmosphere became lively. Someone joked that Ethan had finally escaped domestic life. Another congratulated him for taking control of his future. Laughter filled the room. Glasses clinked. Chloe sat beside him, looking victorious. Ethan laughed along with everyone else. He told himself he deserved this. He told himself he deserved happiness. Nobody mentioned Charlotte more than once. And when her name did come up, it was brief. Casual. Almost dismissive. As though she had simply become part of the past. Yet long after the guests left and the house grew quiet again, Ethan found himself wandering into the kitchen. The counters remained spotless. The lights beneath the cabinets cast a soft glow across the empty room. For reasons he could not explain, he opened a drawer. Inside were neatly labeled folders. Utility accounts. Insurance documents. Property records. Everything perfectly organized. Charlotte's handwriting appeared on every tab. Ethan stared at them for a moment before closing the drawer again. Upstairs, Chloe was already making herself comfortable. Downstairs, the house still carried traces of the woman who had vanished without a fight. Ethan shook off the feeling and headed back toward the staircase. What he could not see was that the first cracks had already begun to form. They were small enough to ignore, quiet enough to miss. But somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, pieces of the life he thought he controlled were already beginning to move without him. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday morning. Ethan Bennett walked into the headquarters of Bennett Strategic Holdings expecting another routine day. The glass tower overlooking downtown Los Angeles had carried his name for nearly a decade, and every time he entered the lobby, employees straightened their posture when they saw him. Success had become so familiar that he barely noticed it anymore. As he crossed the marble floor toward the elevators, his chief financial officer intercepted him with an uneasy expression. "We have a problem with the Mercer account," he said quietly. Ethan barely slowed his pace. "Handle it. We are trying." The response was unusual. Ethan pressed the elevator button. "Then keep trying." 20 minutes later, he sat at the head of the conference table overlooking the city skyline. The Mercer account represented nearly $8 million in annual revenue. Losing it would not destroy the company, but it would certainly get attention. Ethan expected a simple explanation. Instead, he found himself listening to a room full of executives who seemed strangely uncertain. Nobody had clear answers. Nobody understood why negotiations had suddenly collapsed. The client had simply walked away. Who was managing the relationship? Ethan asked. Several people exchanged glances. Finally, someone opened a folder. Charlotte handled most of the direct communication. The room fell silent. Ethan leaned back in his chair. It irritated him how often her name seemed to appear lately. Then assign someone else. "We already did." Another pause. "It is not going well." Ethan dismissed the concern. One client was not a crisis. Businesses lost contracts all the time. Yet throughout the day, more unusual details surfaced. A vendor called requesting information nobody could locate. A project timeline appeared incomplete. A meeting had been scheduled months ago, but no one seemed to know why. Each issue was small by itself. Together, they created a pattern. Late that afternoon, Ethan found himself standing outside a conference room, staring at a whiteboard covered with notes from an ongoing project. Charlotte's handwriting covered half the board. Precise. Organized. Every step mapped out months in advance. He remembered seeing those notes before. At the time, he had barely glanced at them. He always assumed things simply worked because they were supposed to work. He never stopped to ask who made them work. That evening, he returned home later than usual. Chloe was already there, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on a tablet. She looked up with a bright smile. "Long day." Ethan loosened his tie. Nothing important. But even as he said it, he knew it was not true. The house felt different again. Chloe filled the rooms with noise, conversation, and movement, yet somehow the silence underneath remained. While she talked about weekend plans, Ethan drifted toward his home office. He opened a cabinet searching for an old contract. Instead, He discovered dozens of folders organized by year, client, and department. Charlotte's labels appeared everywhere, color-coded, cross-referenced, detailed beyond anything he would have created himself. He pulled out one file at random. Inside were handwritten notes from 6 years earlier, recommendations, risk assessments, long-term projections. Nearly every prediction had proven accurate. Ethan stared at the pages longer than he intended. For years he had introduced Charlotte as his wife. Nothing more. Not because he disliked her. Not because he wanted to hurt her. But because he never truly looked closely enough to see what she had built around him. Across town, somewhere beyond the city lights, Charlotte Bennett was beginning a new chapter of her life. Ethan did not know where she was. He did not know what she was doing. What he did know was far more unsettling. For the first time, he was beginning to realize that the foundation beneath his success carried someone else's fingerprints. 3 weeks after Charlotte left, the problems were no longer isolated incidents. They had become a pattern. Ethan Bennett sat alone in his office on the 38th floor, staring through the glass walls at the Los Angeles skyline. Normally, the view energized him. Today, it felt distant. His desk was covered with reports, unanswered emails, and notes from emergency meetings. Every day seemed to begin with a new complication. Every solution seemed to create another problem. His assistant entered carrying a tablet. The Sterling Group wants to postpone negotiations. Ethan looked up sharply. Why? They said they need additional clarification on the expansion proposal. Ethan rubbed his forehead. The proposal should have been finalized months ago. Who prepared the original framework? His assistant hesitated. By now she already knew the answer. Charlotte did. The silence that followed felt familiar. Ethan thanked her and dismissed her, but the answer lingered in the room long after she was gone. Everywhere he looked, Charlotte's name seemed to appear like a hidden watermark beneath the company. Processes worked because she had designed them. Relationships survived because she had maintained them. Risks had been avoided because she had anticipated them years earlier. He was beginning to realize that what he once considered background support had actually been structural support. Meanwhile, life at home felt increasingly strange. Chloe had fully settled into the mansion. New decorations appeared every week. Expensive deliveries arrived almost daily. The closets that Charlotte once occupied were now filled again, yet the house somehow felt emptier than before. One evening, Ethan returned home after another exhausting 12-hour day. He walked through the front door and immediately noticed several unfamiliar guests gathered around the pool. Music played softly. Laughter echoed through the backyard. Chloe greeted him with a bright smile. I thought we could have a small get-together. Ethan glanced around. There were nearly 20 people there. On a Wednesday? Chloe laughed. You need to. Relax. Relax. The word almost sounded insulting. Ethan had spent the entire day trying to keep multiple business deals from falling apart. Relaxing felt impossible. As the evening continued, he found himself withdrawing from the conversation. He watched people enjoying the view, drinking expensive wine, taking photographs beside the infinity pool. Nobody noticed that he barely spoke. Nobody noticed that he slipped away to his office before 10 o'clock. There, surrounded by silence, he opened another drawer Charlotte had organized years ago. Inside were project binders dating back nearly a decade. Curious, he pulled one from the shelf. The pages were filled with detailed notes. Market forecasts, operational strategies, client histories, handwritten observations. Some entries included warnings about potential weaknesses inside the company. Ethan turned page after page, increasingly unsettled. Charlotte had identified several of the exact issues now threatening the business. Years ago, long before anyone else noticed them. Yet he could not remember ever asking her opinion during executive meetings. He could not remember inviting her to sit at the table where those decisions were made. The realization left an uncomfortable weight in his chest. Outside his office window, the lights of the city stretched for miles. Somewhere beyond them, Charlotte was building a life that no longer revolved around him. Ethan still did not know where she lived. He still had not heard from her once. And for the first time, the absence felt deliberate. Not emotional. Not impulsive. Planned. Carefully planned. As though Charlotte had spent years preparing for a future she hoped she would never need. And now that future had arrived. Some truths do not arrive all at once. They reveal themselves piece by piece, until eventually there is no way to ignore them. By the beginning of the second month, Ethan Bennett was spending more time studying the past than planning the future. The company was still profitable. The headlines were still favorable. From the outside, Bennett Strategic Holdings looked as successful as ever. But inside the executive offices, something had changed. The confidence was gone. Every major decision now seemed to require information nobody could locate. Every important relationship appeared connected to conversations Ethan had never personally handled. One Thursday morning, he sat through a 7-hour strategy review with department leaders. The purpose was simple: identify weaknesses before they became serious problems. What began as a routine meeting quickly became something else. One by one, managers described systems they relied on every day: client retention programs, vendor partnerships, internal reporting structures, risk management procedures. Ethan listened quietly as a disturbing pattern emerged. Nearly every successful process had originated from the same source: Charlotte. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through recommendations nobody even remembered receiving. Her influence was woven through the company so completely that removing her felt like removing support beams from a building. During a break, Ethan walked into the archive room and requested access to several older corporate records. The employee assisting him seemed surprised. Few executives ever reviewed documents from years earlier. Ethan spent the next 2 hours reading. By the end, he felt as though he were discovering an entirely different version of his own company. There were proposals Charlotte had written that saved millions of dollars. Market analyses that accurately predicted industry changes years before competitors reacted. Detailed assessments identifying clients who later became the firm's most profitable accounts. Time after time, her recommendations had proven correct. Time after time, someone else had presented them during meetings. Usually Ethan. He sat motionless as the realization settled over him. The success he had always considered his greatest achievement suddenly looked different. Not false, but incomplete. Much more incomplete than he wanted to admit. That evening, he returned home carrying several binders. Chloe noticed immediately. "You have been working nonstop lately," she said from the living room. "You need to stop obsessing over the company." Ethan barely looked up. "I am trying to understand something." Chloe smiled impatiently. "The past does not matter." The statement lingered in the air. Ethan glanced toward her. For the first time, he realized how differently she viewed the world. Chloe loved results. Charlotte had understood foundations. One admired success after it existed. The other had quietly built it. Later that night, long after Chloe had gone upstairs, Ethan remained alone in his office. He opened another folder. This one contained notes from nearly 8 years earlier. Attached to the final page was a simple memo written in Charlotte's handwriting. It outlined a long-term growth strategy. At the bottom was a sentence he could not stop reading. "Great companies are built by solving problems before anyone notices they exist." Ethan leaned back slowly. Outside, the city lights stretched across the darkness like scattered stars. Inside, another uncomfortable truth was beginning to emerge. Charlotte had never simply supported the company. She had helped shape its future. And somehow, over all those years, he had mistaken her contribution for loyalty instead of brilliance. For the first time since she disappeared, Ethan found himself asking a question he should have asked years ago. If Charlotte was capable of building something this successful for someone else, what could she build for herself now that she was finally free to try? The invitation arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. Ethan Bennett almost ignored it. His inbox had become a battlefield of urgent requests, revised forecasts, and meetings that seemed to multiply by the hour. Yet something about the subject line caught his attention. Pacific Business Innovation Summit. Featured speaker announcement. He clicked without thinking. A sleek digital brochure opened on his screen. The event would be held at one of the most prestigious conference centers in San Diego, drawing investors, executives, and entrepreneurs from across the country. Ethan skimmed the page until a photograph stopped him cold. For several seconds, he simply stared. It was Charlotte. The image had clearly been taken recently. She stood beneath soft lighting, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her expression calm and confident. Beneath the photograph appeared a title he had never seen before: Founder and Chief Strategic Officer, Bennett Advisory Group. Ethan read it twice. Then a third time. He had never heard of Bennett Advisory Group. He opened another browser window and searched the name. The results appeared immediately. Articles, interviews, business journals, industry newsletters. Everywhere he looked, Charlotte's company seemed to be gaining attention. The firm specialized in organizational growth strategy, corporate restructuring, and long-term expansion planning. The same disciplines she had quietly mastered for years. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stunned. Somehow she had built an entirely new company in just a few months. More surprising was the quality of her clients. Several names on the website belonged to organizations far larger than anything he expected. This was not a small consulting project. It was a serious business. His eyes drifted back to the conference brochure. Another name appeared beside Charlotte's photograph. Alexander Hayes. Ethan recognized it instantly. Everyone in the industry did. Alexander Hayes was one of the most influential investors on the West Coast. A billionaire known for backing companies long before they became success stories. He rarely appeared at public events. Yet according to the program, he would be participating in a keynote discussion with Charlotte. Ethan opened the schedule and stared at it. Their names appeared side by side. Not once. Multiple times. Panel discussions. Investor roundtables. Strategic leadership forums. The pairing seemed deliberate. Throughout the day, he found it impossible to focus on anything else. During meetings, Charlotte's photograph kept resurfacing in his mind. The confidence in her expression. The composure. The fact that she looked happier than he remembered seeing her in years. That evening, Ethan drove home through heavy traffic beneath dark California skies. Chloe greeted him enthusiastically at the front door, talking about an upcoming charity gala she wanted them to attend. Ethan listened without hearing much. Finally, she noticed his distraction. "What is wrong?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. Then he showed her the conference announcement. Chloe studied the screen briefly. Her smile faded. "So she started a business." Ethan nodded. "Apparently." Chloe handed back the phone. "Then let her have it." The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Because something about the article continued to bother him. Not jealousy. Not regret. Curiosity. For months he had imagined Charlotte rebuilding her life quietly somewhere out of sight. Instead, she seemed to be stepping onto a much larger stage. And somehow, standing beside one of the most respected investors in America. Late that night, Ethan sat alone in his office and reopened the conference website. He enlarged the photograph again. Charlotte was smiling slightly. Not the forced smile she used at corporate dinners. Not the polite smile she wore during networking events. This one looked different. Genuine. Confident. As though she had finally become the person she was always meant to be. And for the first time since she disappeared, Ethan realized he no longer knew where her story was heading. The conference center overlooked San Diego Bay, where sunlight danced across the water and luxury yachts drifted slowly through the harbor. Ethan Bennett arrived earlier than necessary. He told himself it was because he wanted to attend several investment panels. The truth was simpler. He wanted answers. The lobby buzzed with conversation as entrepreneurs, investors, and executives moved between sessions carrying coffee cups and conference badges. Giant digital displays rotated through the day schedule. Ethan scanned the list until he found the session he had been thinking about for weeks. Strategic Leadership in a Changing Market. Featured speakers, Charlotte Bennett and Alexander Hayes. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat near the back of a packed auditorium. The room darkened as the presentation began. First came Alexander Hayes. Tall, composed, and carrying the quiet confidence that often accompanies extraordinary success. The audience listened carefully to every word. Then Charlotte walked onto the stage. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. She looked nothing like the woman who had quietly organized his calendar, attended corporate dinners, and stood beside him at networking events. She looked like someone entirely different. Not because of her clothes. Not because of the applause. Because she seemed completely at ease. She was no longer standing in someone else's shadow. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. During that time, Ethan noticed something remarkable. Every time Charlotte spoke, people listened. Not politely. Intently. She answered difficult questions without hesitation. She explained complex business challenges with clarity and precision. Several audience members took notes. Others nodded in agreement. Even Alexander Hayes appeared genuinely interested in her perspective. After the session ended, attendees immediately surrounded the stage. Ethan remained seated. He watched from a distance as executives waited to introduce themselves. Investors requested meetings. Entrepreneurs asked for advice. Charlotte handled every interaction with calm professionalism. Eventually, the crowd thinned. That was when Ethan saw something he could not stop thinking about. Alexander Hayes approached Charlotte carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed her one. They exchanged a few words and laughed. It was a simple interaction. Yet there was an ease between them that suggested familiarity. Not the familiarity of recent acquaintances. Something older. Something deeper. Curious, Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon gathering information. By evening, he had learned more than he expected. Several people at the conference knew the story. Years ago, before Bennett Strategic Holdings became successful, Alexander Hayes had attended a private business forum where Charlotte presented a growth strategy analysis. The presentation impressed him so much that he offered her an opportunity to join one of his investment ventures. She declined. Not once. Multiple times over several years. According to industry rumors, Alexander never stopped trying to recruit her. Ethan struggled to process what he was hearing. The timeline did not make sense. Back then, Charlotte had been helping him build his company. She had been organizing meetings, managing operations, solving problems behind the scenes. Meanwhile, one of the most influential investors in America had been recognizing her value all along. As sunset painted the harbor in shades of orange and gold, Ethan stood alone outside the conference center staring across the water. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. Charlotte had not suddenly become successful after leaving. She had always possessed the talent. She had always possessed the vision. The difference was that someone else had seen it. Someone else had recognized it years before Ethan ever did. And now, standing beside Alexander Hayes on one of the biggest stages in the industry, Charlotte was no longer hiding what she was capable of. She was simply becoming visible. Some meetings change nothing. Others quietly divide a life into before and after. 2 weeks after the conference in San Diego, Ethan Bennett sent a message he had rewritten at least a dozen times. It was short, respectful, simple. He asked Charlotte if they could talk. He expected silence. Instead, 24 hours later, a reply appeared. One sentence. Friday, 4 o'clock. The harbor room. No further explanation. On Friday afternoon, Ethan arrived 20 minutes early. The harbor room overlooked the Pacific Ocean from the upper floor of a quiet coastal hotel in Newport Beach. Large windows filled the space with natural light. Waves rolled steadily beyond the glass. The atmosphere felt calm, almost too calm. Ethan spent the next few minutes staring at the entrance. Then Charlotte walked in. She wore a cream-colored blazer and carried a leather portfolio under one arm. Nothing about her appearance seemed designed to impress anyone. Yet somehow she commanded the room the moment she entered. Ethan stood automatically. Charlotte smiled politely and took the seat across from him. Not cold, not warm, simply composed. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You look good." Charlotte nodded. "Thank you." Her voice was familiar. Hearing it again after so many months felt strangely unsettling. Ethan took a breath. "I have spent a lot of time thinking." Charlotte listened quietly. The ocean shimmered behind her through the windows. "I should have appreciated you more." She said nothing. "I should have listened more, paid attention more." Another pause. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "I did not realize how much you were carrying until you were gone." Charlotte folded her hands on the table. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, no triumph. Somehow that made the conversation harder. Ethan had prepared himself for resentment. Instead, he was facing indifference. Not cruel indifference, peaceful indifference, the kind that arrives after healing. "For a long time," he said quietly, "I convinced myself that everything would keep working without you." Charlotte looked out toward the water for a moment before answering. "Most people believe that about the things they depend on." The words landed harder than criticism ever could have. Ethan swallowed. "I made mistakes." Charlotte nodded. "Yes." Nothing more. No lecture. No argument. Just a simple acknowledgement of reality. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Do you ever think about us?" The question hung between them. Charlotte considered it carefully. "I think about who we used to be." Ethan waited. "And?" Charlotte offered a small smile. "I think we both needed different futures." For the first time, Ethan understood something that had been escaping him for months. Charlotte was not protecting herself from him anymore. She no longer needed protection. The distance between them existed because she had already crossed it. Emotionally, mentally, completely. They spoke for another 30 minutes. About work, about life, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. When the conversation finally ended, Charlotte stood and gathered her portfolio. Ethan rose with her. Charlotte. She stopped. Yes. He searched for words that seemed impossible to find. Eventually, he settled on the truth. I am sorry. Charlotte looked at him for several seconds. Then she smiled gently. I know. There was kindness in her voice. Genuine kindness. But there was no invitation. No opening. No possibility hidden beneath the words. She wished him well and walked toward the exit. Ethan remained standing beside the table long after she disappeared from view. Through the windows, the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. And for the first time, he understood that losing Charlotte had never been his punishment. Realizing her worth too late was. 6 months later, the ballroom of the Pacific Crown Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and soft golden light. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Investors, executives, founders, and journalists moved between tables while cameras flashed near the stage. It was the most anticipated business awards event of the year, celebrating innovation, leadership, and emerging companies that had transformed their industries. Ethan Bennett sat near the middle of the room. His company had survived a difficult year. Not without losses. Not without hard lessons. But it had survived. The man who entered the ballroom that evening was very different from the one who had watched Charlotte walk away months earlier. Success no longer felt permanent. Relationships no longer felt guaranteed. Some lessons had arrived too late to prevent pain, but not too late to teach wisdom. Across the room, a sudden shift in attention caused conversations to quiet. People began turning toward the entrance. Ethan followed their gaze. Charlotte had arrived. For a brief moment, the room seemed to pause. She moved through the ballroom with calm confidence, greeting familiar faces along the way. The applause that followed her arrival was spontaneous. Genuine. Not because she was famous, because she had earned respect. Ethan watched as business leaders approached to shake her hand. Several journalists requested interviews. Others simply wanted a few minutes of her time. Charlotte handled each interaction with the same quiet grace she had always possessed. The difference was that people finally noticed it. A few minutes later, another figure entered. Alexander Hayes. The room reacted immediately. Yet what happened next drew even more attention. Alexander crossed the ballroom directly toward Charlotte. When he reached her, they exchanged a warm greeting before walking together toward the front tables reserved for keynote guests. Ethan felt no jealousy. Surprisingly, that emotion had disappeared months ago. What remained was something simpler. Understanding. The evening progressed quickly. Awards were presented. Speeches were delivered. Then came the final announcement of the night. Strategic Visionary of the Year. The presenter opened the envelope. A smile appeared. This year's recipient transformed years of unseen expertise into one of the fastest-growing advisory firms in the country. Please join me in congratulating Charlotte Bennett. The ballroom erupted in applause. Guests rose to their feet. Cameras flashed from every direction. Ethan stood with everyone else. He applauded sincerely, perhaps more sincerely than anyone in the room. Charlotte walked onto the stage beneath the spotlight. She accepted the award and thanked her team. She thanked her clients. She thanked the mentors who believed in her. Then, before leaving the stage, she paused. Her eyes swept across the audience. Success is often misunderstood, she said softly. People think it begins when someone finally notices you. In reality, it begins much earlier. It begins the moment you decide your value does not depend on being seen. The room fell silent. Then came another wave of applause. Stronger this time. Longer. Charlotte smiled and stepped away from the microphone. As she descended the stage, Alexander Hayes met her near the stairs. The two exchanged a few quiet words before walking toward the celebration waiting below. Ethan remained standing for a moment longer. Around him, hundreds of people celebrated Charlotte's achievement. Yet what struck him most was not her success. It was her peace. She no longer carried the weight of proving herself. She no longer needed validation from anyone, least of all from him. Months earlier, Charlotte had left a simple note behind. At the time, Ethan believed he was gaining freedom. Only later did he understand what had truly happened. Charlotte had not taken revenge. She had not tried to destroy him. She had simply walked toward a life that no longer required his permission. And in doing so, she found something far more valuable than victory. She found herself.